Hello everyone, my name is Emma Lovell and I am a research fellow in the Risk and Resilience Programme at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute. I'd like to start by thanking the Government of Switzerland for hosting this conference and to UNDRR for the opportunity to speak on the Ignite stage. To achieve the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and to deliver on Target E, governments and practitioners have a vital role in promoting inclusive, resilience-building policies and programs that leave no one behind. Oop. Okay. In 2018, over 60 million people were affected by natural hazard-related disasters around the world. Due to rising living costs, demographic changes, conflict, and loss of natural ecosystems, more people are living in coastal and exposed areas to natural hazards. We know that marginalized groups are often disproportionately affected by disasters due to structural inequalities that exist within society. This often includes people with disabilities, women, children, older persons, and ethnic groups, amongst others. When a disaster occurs, many governments and operational organizations tend to group these people together under the term vulnerable for response and recovery efforts. But the reality is that people are complicated. They have different identities, needs, priorities, and capacities, which will shift and change over time. And their experience of natural hazards will be different depending on the different socioeconomic, cultural, political, and environmental contexts in which they're living in. Lumping these groups together in a catch-all phrase of vulnerability simply doesn't work. This brings me to the crux of my presentation. We need a deeper understanding of how different factors intersect to create exclusions and inequalities in society, and the impact that this has in terms of people's capacity to prepare for, cope with, and respond to natural hazards, climate change, and climate variability. It's time for a rethink on ways to better tackle intersecting inequalities and vulnerability reduction so that no one is left behind. Intersectional thinking challenges the one-size-fits-all approach and is a way of capturing interaction between categories of social difference, such as age, sex, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And it also captures how these affect individuals, social practices, institutions, and relationships over time. Intersectional thinking also recognizes that social groups are not homogeneous or static. Different identities, contexts, and forms of discrimination and marginalization intersect or overlap, and these will affect people's ability to prepare and manage natural hazards and climate change over the course of their lives. There is no single approach or defined set of methods that represent best practice for understanding intersecting inequalities, and developing a tool that is both sensitive enough to measure specifics while also being practical enough to be used in the field is a huge challenge. There is a need to find effective and practical ways of promoting intersectional approaches to vulnerability reduction and resilience building in both programming and policy. In 2015, I developed a gender-sensitive methodology with ActionAid to measure and compare women and men's resilience to climate change and natural hazards at the local level. Over the past year, I've been working with colleagues to take this tried and tested toolkit one step further to investigate intersecting inequalities and another intersecting social factor. In addition to just measuring the difference between women and men's resilience, we also looked into ethnicity and caste in the case of flooding in Nepal, and majority and minority clans in Kenya who have different access to political representation and resources in relation to drought. The research aims to understand the different factors that influence people's vulnerability and resilience to natural hazards and climate change through a gender and intersectional lens. We used a two-pronged approach. First, we assessed different aspects of people's resilience at the local level based on 4 components. These are economic, social, infrastructural, and institutional. Second, we conducted key informant interviews and focus group discussions to help better understand the approaches and policies that different organizations and institutes are taking at the local and national level to understand intersecting inequalities and the policies and practices they're taking to build resilience for all. While I do not have time to go into the findings from the 2 case studies in detail during this presentation, the research reveals some interesting aspects of resilience and intersecting inequalities. The study also found that there's growing interest in intersectionality as a concept among policymakers and operational agencies, but its application is still quite new and challenging. Next, I will look at 3 challenges that we as an international community can help to address to move intersectional approaches forward. First, we need to address the lack of methodologies and approaches for measuring and understanding intersectional factors. There's currently a lack of methodology and tools for identifying and understanding intersecting inequalities. Gender analysis is standard in resilience planning and programming, but methodologies and tools are needed for identifying and understanding the intersection between different inequality factors affecting people's ability to manage natural hazards and climate change. Monitoring and evaluation processes often do not systematically include data disaggregated by sex, age, ethnicity, disability, and other socioeconomic factors. Inadequate data can make it difficult to identify vulnerable and marginalized groups. It also means that policies and systems are not informed by the local context and do not respond to the needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities of these groups in relation to natural hazards and climate change. Recommendations include the need to champion systematic data collection, disaggregated by sex, age, economic status, ethnicity, caste, and disability, to identify marginalized groups and make their different needs and capacities more visible to decision makers. We also need to build methodologies and tools to better capture the complexities of intersecting inequalities, a means to identify and measure differences between social groups so that policymakers and practitioners can devise locally appropriate solutions to build resilience to natural hazards and climate change. The second challenge is the lack of capacity and coordination to implement policies and programs that respond to intersecting inequalities and take an intersectional approach to build resilience to natural hazards, climate change, and climate variability. There are challenges relating to capacity, coordination, and lack of resources for designing and implementing policies and programs which aim to build inclusive resilience to natural hazards and climate change. Intersectional approaches to vulnerability reduction and resilience building remain a new area for most organizations, many of whom still target their programs at supporting particular social groups, including women, children, and people with disabilities. There is also a tension between approaches that subscribe to the ethos of resilience for all or inclusion for all, and that need to target particularly disadvantaged groups. So in terms of recommendations, we need to enhance knowledge and capacity to manage the resilience of the most marginalized groups at the subnational level, to put in place the technical, financial, and human resources needed to support effective and inclusive policies and preparedness, response, and recovery implementation. We also need to ensure better coordination around policies and programs that aim to build resilience to natural hazards and climate change, gender equality and social inclusion to ensure that no one is left behind. This includes building more vertical integration between national, subnational and local levels of government and organisations, and horizontal lesson sharing and coordination between different sectoral ministries, departments and organisations to scale up action on inclusive climate change adaptation and disaster risk management. The third challenge is lack of longer-term inclusive programming. Disaster risk management remains largely focused on reactive, short-term emergency or relief responses, and much research tends to focus on the short-term direct impacts of natural hazard-related disasters on people, as opposed to considering the indirect and longer-term impacts on their well-being and longer-term development outcomes. Donor funding is often short-term, which reduces the possibility of creating meaningful or transformative change. At the same time, donor demands may not be aligned with organisations and with what organisations identify as necessary for the resilience programme to be equitable and inclusive. This is a challenge for organisations trying to respond to multiple donor requirements within short timeframes and limited funding. So, for recommendations, agencies and organisations should work with governments and donors to promote a better understanding of how different factors intersect to shape vulnerability and exclusion over a person's life course, and the need for longer-term funding that build inclusive resilience in research, policy and programming. Similarly, donors and governments should invest in comprehensive, long-term, integrated programs that take into account the full disaster risk management cycle and ensure the continuity of systems and services, including education, healthcare, and employment opportunities that promote people's well-being despite environmental shocks and stresses. If we're serious about achieving the aims and ambitions of the Sendai framework, governments and organisations must do more to promote policies and programmes that take an intersectional approach to vulnerability reduction and resilience building to help build the resilience of all and ensure no one is left behind. If you would like to hear more about our work on building resilience for all and intersectional approaches to vulnerability reduction in multi-hazard contexts, I have copies of the papers shown here at the back, so please do come and find me afterwards. Thank you very much for your time.